This is month 4 of the Pāramitā challenge, December 2021. There was a month off last month in November, and here we have the first week being the 6 perfections and their subdivision from the Sutra on Understanding the Profound and Esoteric Doctrine. Number 4, diligence, also effort and zeal. And these pervade all the precepts, it says here, and there's 3 subdivisions. Zeal to exert effort like one who has put on an armor. Zeal to exert effort in engendering good. Zeal to exert effort in benefiting sentient beings. So, first off, this word zeal. It's interesting how there's also a similar word called zealot. And I think it's beyond the scope of this podcast to go into that, but I just pointed out as interesting. Diligence and effort is the one I'm inclined more to. Now this first one, zeal to exert effort like one who has put on an armor. It's interesting, this image of armor, right? So in the positive sense, this is someone who feels protected. So there's really a lot less fear, right? Because there's a protection already in place. So there's less apprehension that they're going to get it wrong and something might backfire and get hurt really easily. So that's the upside. Now maybe the drawback of this image of armor is that we can kind of shut down and protect ourselves from opening our heart, right? If we're armoring up, then there's no vulnerability there to possibly feel deeply and also connect deeply with others. That comes from that vulnerability, lack of armoring and defensiveness, and closing down and shutting, and placing an artificial barrier between us and the world. But let's just go with the protection thing and say, yes, the kind of unifying idea that makes sense to me here is what's needed to be able to feel safe enough to arouse and sustain energy, effort, and diligence for what's needed. The 4 right efforts are eliminating unwholesome states, preventing unwholesome states from arising, maintaining wholesome states that have arisen, and generating wholesome states that have yet arisen. So the second one here is zeal to exert effort in engendering good. Now, it's interesting here, they got the 2 kind of energizing words. Zeal to exert effort. So in one way, maybe that's a little bit redundant. It's basically motivation, though, to amp up the energy, the effort, the diligence, to do good. And this engendering, it's interesting how popular this gender thing has become, like out of the blue all of a sudden, relatively speaking here. And of course, engendering. So interesting choice of word there. But this just speaks in general, the way I take it, to our goodness and how that's what it's all about, goodness. And raises the questions, well, what is goodness? How do I recognize that? How do I promote that? How do I serve that? How do I increase that with effort? There's this interesting phrase called the greater good, and I think this is important enough to point out now. And I don't think it's been used as much recently as it has in the, recent memory before that. So for me, it's like a kind of a red flag if somebody just says greater good, do it for the greater good. Well, the obvious question there is the greater good of who? And then this can, if it's not specific, it can allude to, well, there's good, but this group here is a greater good, So when I see that, it could very well have good intentions, but it could also not so much. So that is why I place importance on, well, the greater good of who? And if I had to answer that myself, it would be the greater good of all beings everywhere. So this third one, zeal to exert effort in benefiting sentient beings. So this ties in with goodness. And again, this zeal to exert effort. Zeal, and then exertion, and then effort. So this is like, I guess it was my bad on the previous thing. So it's actually like a triple energy thing here. Yeah, and I've spoke to this before. Once we're in a good enough space to help ourselves, then it just really doesn't make sense to really do much anything else but be of service, right? To share what we know with others, because what are the other options? We can just keep piling up merit and goodness and good for ourselves, but that would be service to self, and we can't take that all with us, right? So what do? It seems like the really only option is service. And it doesn't have to be necessarily, service with time or money. It can just be an energetic thing, a consciousness thing, or not just, but in addition to a presence, intent too. It can be in our choices, and knowing that even if we don't see an immediate effect or think it's insignificant, know that a bucket of water is filled up drop by drop. The classic saying that don't think bad will come to you as drop by drop a water bucket's filled, and the same as the opposite. Don't think that goodness won't come because, again, a bucket is filled up drop by drop. And this is the first week of the 4th month of the Pāramitā Challenge, December 2021. So week 2 of the Pāramitā Challenge. This is month 4, December 2021. This is from the 10 Pāramitas in the Doctrine of Mere Consciousness. The 10 excellent moral exercises are the 10 Pāramitas. This is number 4. English translation is zeal in making progress. And the commentary is zeal in making progress is of 3 kinds. Zeal in producing great resolutions, zeal in acquiring good spiritual dharmas, and 3, zeal in promoting the well-being and happiness of sentient beings. So zeal in producing great resolutions. So maybe in the West, we hear the word resolutions. Perhaps we're thinking of like New Year's resolutions, things we hope to accomplish, maybe goals that are more serious and that involve effort and zeal to accomplish. But what is a great resolution? What are the criteria? And how is the zeal, effort, or energy involved in these great resolutions and in producing great resolutions? The most obvious one would be making a resolve for, again, right effort. These are the things that are clearly laid out. Preventing unwholesome states from arising, eliminating unwholesome states that have arisen before that even, maintaining wholesome states that are present, and producing wholesome states that have yet arisen. And where wholesome can also be skillful as a substitute. This is the word kusala. And then the opposite, akusala. But this effort and zeal and resolution perhaps could be applied to much of the path, especially where effort and energy is required. It's like the Eightfold Noble Path. They all interweave within each other, kind of all interdependent and boost and support each other, really aren't that separable in a way. So when are resolutions needed? When is resolve needed? And when does resolve need to be backed up a little bit, backed down from a little bit? And this is where wisdom and discernment can come in to set the bar for what is a great resolution, what is not, what new resolutions need to be produced, and what current ones need to be given more energy and effort. So number 2, zeal in acquiring good spiritual dharmas. Acquiring good spiritual dharmas. So it's interesting. At one point, or at some point, I feel acquiring is a good thing to have for spiritual dharmas because there's just kind of this natural or maybe unnatural energy to acquire things, right? In everyday life, people are trying to acquire a paycheck, acquire a partner, acquire living place or a better living place, acquire cars, investments, and acquire this and that, acquire experiences and knowledge and wisdom. So this acquisition, there's a lot more wholesome acquisitions than others. And in this instance, spiritual dharmas, good spiritual dharmas, would be something beneficial to acquire, at least for a while. It's also contrasted with relinquishment, letting go, abandoning. So these are perhaps paradoxical values that are also wholesome and beneficial. But again, it depends on what's being acquired and what's being relinquished, let go of, abandoned. So eventually even good spiritual dharmas will likely have to be abandoned too, just like the parable of the raft, the dharma being the raft. Once across the flood, the river, the further shore, there's really no need to carry it around anymore. So acquiring good spiritual dharmas. So what is a bad spiritual dharma? Maybe these are just wrong teachings or wrong paths or things that lead towards more suffering and away from long-term happiness and well-being for ourselves and others. And of course, the word spiritual is an interesting one now because it's been used a lot. And I think its potency has been diminished a lot. And of course, dharmas here, I guess, refers to as the teachings of the Buddha, or also the truth of the way things are. So for me, the spiritual dharmas would be kind of a redundant usage here. But so with the criticism aside, what does this mean? How can we put effort into acquiring good spiritual dharmas? Well, in today's day and age, there's so many different teachings out there at our fingertips. So there's really not much excuse to dive into them, study, familiarize yourself with teachings and truth and reality. No really shortage of ways to share these and actually seek them out, invite them in, put out calls for these, for things that aren't already in existence. And the energy and effort and zeal behind this can get momentum. So when we use kind of review knowledge or just reflection on, the benefits of good teachings, knowing the benefits of how certain teachings and ways to see reality can benefit not only us, but other people. Notice the changes in our lives for the better. And perhaps this plays into more of like some addictive tendencies, but in a good way. So instead of putting a lot of energy into acquiring things that probably won't do us much good, we can, if that energy is there, redirect it into things more beneficial and wholesome. Finding a good teacher or teachers that we resonate with, and spiritual friends too. Pouring our energy and effort into that and reveling in the goodness, the rewards of this. So number 3, zeal in promoting the well-being and happiness of sentient beings. As I've mentioned before, once we're at a certain spot in our lives where our well-being and happiness is at a place that's adequate, we can experience even more happiness and well-being by promoting the well-being and happiness of others. So it's just this constant reinforcing feedback loop of the good sort. As we help ourselves, we help others. As others are helped, we're helped, benefited. So anything we acquire in life, we eventually can't take with us. And while we continue to increase our well-being and happiness, it just doesn't make sense to me to just serve ourselves at some point. We have so much to share and so many things we can do to help. And at the same time, not stepping on anybody's journey as well. So just being open when the chance presents itself, or when someone comes to us asking for help, well-being, specific wisdom, and also having online platforms where we can do this as well. And so we don't have to wait for specific things. We can share in public without forcing it on anybody. And then if anybody's interested, perhaps they'll come across it online that way. One specific example that comes to mind is, I can't remember where I heard this, is how many times do we take for granted that we haven't taken another human life today? more than likely anybody that's listening to this hasn't done that, right? And I mean, it seems kind of absurd in one way, but just think if everybody on earth would just refrain from taking human life for one day, how different this world would be. And knowing that we, like everyone else, desire well-being and happiness. We all have that in common. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I don't want to be well. I want to be shitty today. I want to be sad and miserable. So in this way, we all have this in common. And we can remember this when we see someone having a bad day, or we're having a bad day, or we fall short of our goals and expectations. And also celebration too, when things are calling for celebration, because it's really challenging to be upset at something when we're celebrating it. Tying back into resolutions so we can resolve and intend for well-being and happiness for ourselves and others. Can invite that in, use the 4 right efforts to promote this as well. And that's week 2, December 2021, month 4 of the Pāramitā challenge. Wholeness and welcome. This is Josh Dipple from Integrating Presence, and today is Mindfulness of Speaking. And the description for this event, I've got, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it helpful? Is it the right time? We'll explore these guidelines for wise and skillful speech and share stories, challenges, insights, and do some practices. So this is also going to double as the Pāramitā challenge that I've done one podcast on for the previous 3 months. And I'll just fly through that real quick, reading what's of that pertaining to this, and it happened to line up. So this is week 3, the 4th month of the Pāramitā challenge, and it deals with today's topic, the 10 non-virtuous and 10 virtuous actions divided into the unwholesome and wholesome with speech. So number 4 is false speech or lying, contrasted with speaking only what is truthful. 5 is harsh words, contrasted with speaking with a tone of gentle caring. 6, divisive speech and slander, contrasted with harmonious, unifying speech. 7, idle speech and gossip, contrasted with discuss beneficial topics. It's also one of the 58 Bodhisattva Vows, which I haven't taken, but I'm interested in studying them. It's 4th, don't lie or engage in wrong speech. And this is from the Brahma's Net Sutra, Prohibition on Intentional Lying. My disciples, if you engage in lying on your own, encourage others to lie or lie through deception, then you are involved in the causes of lying, the conditions of lying, the methods of lying, and the act of lying. This also includes saying that one has seen what one has not seen, saying you have not seen something you have seen, or lying implicitly through bodily actions are within one's own mind. Bodhisattvas always give rise to right speech and right views, and also lead all sentient beings to practice right speech and right views. If, on the other hand, you lead sentient beings to wrong speech, wrong views, and wrong activities, this constitutes a bodhisattva prajika offense. And then the 4th major precept prohibits false speech. Disciple of the Buddha must not himself engage in false speech, encourage others to do so, facilitate false speech, nor may he involve himself in the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of false speech, to the extent of saying that he has seen what he has not seen, or he has never seen what he's actually seen, or lying through physical or mental deeds. A bodhisattva should always maintain proper speech and proper views and lead all other beings to maintain them as well. If instead he causes all beings to give rise to deviant karma, he thereby commits a bodhisattva offense. And those are really, the last 2 paragraphs are very similar in language. So we'll come back to some of that stuff. I will probably put some stuff under a microscope here, but just know that when we speak and it's coming from a place of kindness and care, that usually supersedes all this other stuff that I'm going to mention. It's really quite simple, can be, but just for thoroughness sake, I'll dive into this. So one of the things around that's happening, I think I've noticed, and maybe somebody has too, is the millennial texting with the millennial generation. And, I think I've even seen people that are sitting right next to each other, instead of speaking to each other, they're texting each other, right? And so this has just become a culture. If I had to take a wild guess, I would say texting takes a level of intensity out of interaction, perhaps. It's closely intertwined with our devices as well. Now there can be, emotional charge interwoven within text, but sometimes it's not coming directly with the person they're texting. It could be something that's recently happened or something that's happened in the past. There could be so many things that go into like emotionality and emotional charge around texting. So it's really complex. I know I have challenges when texting of misinterpretation, both ways of what I'm getting as a text and what I'm sending out. Sometimes I read way more into what the text is, or sometimes, I misinterpret it and then my response is off. Today in speaking, I used to not see this so much, but now it's obviously become more apparent that there can be a lot of pain involved in speech, especially people, acting out things that have been done to them. Usually when somebody says something hurtful or negative or whatever harm is spoken to us, and things we rightfully say to others, it's usually a reflection of what's already been done to us. And so this is kind of the victimizer cycle. So when we're not aware that what others say to us really doesn't have much at all to do with us, it's showing us where the other person is at on their path and what's been done to them, both negative and positive. And so becoming aware of that, and when we have a choice to break these victimizer cycles in this victim programming and victimizer programming, and also victim shaming too, that's another thing. Of course, the most obvious is when people lash out with speech. I'm sure we've all done that as well, because a lot of us are just going through so much pain, and it's almost like an outlet. And so, as well as anger. So it can be a double-edged sword, Some people deal with it by just shutting down. And sometimes that can be the most helpful thing for a little while instead of hurting others. But then if we internalize it, then we can hurt ourselves too. So it's about finding a space and a way to release what's saying in a skillful way, in a skillful environment, with friends, maybe with professionals, just with practice, even maybe monologuing like this, I don't know. So I'll just share some of my background with this. I guess maybe in high school, maybe even grade school, I wasn't really comprehending why people weren't paying attention to what I was saying. And it finally dawned on me they were paying more attention to how it was being said. And it seems so, obvious now. But it's even more noticeable when someone is speaking very emotionally, and they're really heated. And it can also be when clinging to views and opinions and ideas, like I used to do, even more so than now, right? And so, and realize, especially people that identify more with emotions, they'll tend to pay just as much, if not more, attention to the conveyance and the emotion behind the words than the actual content itself, right? To this expression. And another thing, I used to abuse speech by just, kind of having a decent grasp of the English language and using it to really not respect its power, but only using it to gain influence and, gain and influencing people. And so, like the silver tongue, right? And way with words. And so that's kind of an underlying thing of at that point there was really no notice of an emphasis on non-harming. Okay, so a lot of times also be quick to speak because we don't want to, or at least I know in my experience that I don't want to look like I don't know, or I'm stupid or something, or not helpful. So sometimes I will just forget to say, oh, well, I don't really know. Here's my best guess. I'll just jump into just saying whatever in order to look intelligent, or come off as not stupid, or not helpful. So I'll just kind of jump in and say something. And then I guess there's the opposite, where people are kind of more standoffish and maybe indifferent to something they possibly could help out, but for whatever reason, they just are indifferent towards it. And another thing that happens quite regularly in my experience is I will forget significant key points in what I'm trying to say, and then I remember later, and then wondering if I should go back and say that. Now, sometimes, it comes into where, okay, yeah, I really need to go say that, because it will completely change what I really meant to say, but it was an oversight, or something wasn't remembered, and then it was. But then a lot of times you go back and you say that, and they're like, well, I don't even remember what you were saying. And then so it's like we put, sometimes too much emphasis can be said, but other times it's like, oh, we just blow stuff off, and then where we could easily, it wouldn't take but a second to backtrack and clear things up, say things more wisely, skillfully, kindly, or just things that have been forgotten. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about public speaking. So this might not apply to too many people, but I'm sure we've all had to do some kind of public speaking, and whether at job or school, or maybe we're considering more of it or whatever. I worked in online marketing for a while, and I was behind the scenes, organizing and editing podcasts and whatnot, promoting them. And I was pretty much, it would have never considered going in front of a camera or a microphone. I don't know if it terrified me. I don't know. I really didn't have much interest in it at all. I was just content with doing the behind the scenes work. One of the things that was really awkward was hearing my own voice played back. And I'm sure we've all experienced this too. And it's interesting just to hear your own voice played back and what kind of response and reaction we have to that. And now it's almost like, okay, there's a lot of room for improvement. And that's okay. It's just being okay with stuttering and stammering, a lot of uhs and ahs, and so that helps me in one way, but in another way, it's like, okay, well, maybe there needs to be more practice with this, in order to improve on that aspect. And then also now, it's more of a spiritual ego than an inferior or superior ego. So now you've got things like balancing, well, as long as I have this intention of non-harming, then it's pretty much all okay. I can just either be guided or trust that whatever I'm going to say is just going to come out and it's what's meant to be said. And so there's that side with, okay, am I being a little bit overly loose with speech? And so then I start over-regulating, self-censoring, and putting all my speech and actions and intent under a spiritual microscope, and just process instead of just trusting. So there's that dynamic. And then when it comes to actually recording itself, there's some days where when I do recordings offline that aren't live, I can get kind of into a meditative state, and I just talk very slow and deliberately, and can take long pauses of contemplation until the next dawning of realization happens, right? And then in the editing, there's this thing where you can remove silences. So you can, get kind of almost where you want to be. You can represent yourself that you wouldn't normally represent in just kind of other modalities or other situations or places in life. And so you could take like a 20-minute recording and cut it down maybe by a half or 2/3 with the silences removed. So another thing is, how much time do we have in a public speaking? So that's obviously going to affect how maybe anxious we'll get to get through everything, or if we'll just there's so much with that, right? So are we going to just speed up and try to get everything done? Just say, nah, skip it. Just got to stop here. So what amount of relaxation needs to be involved, but what amount of energy? I tend to be a little more animated, a little more energy when speaking. And, but some people, they're really kind of, grasping for words. And I can be like that too on some days, right? It's like, oh, the mind isn't really kicked in yet. And kind of, what's the right word here? And am I slowing down too much, right? Locking up, freezing up, but usually performance anxiety, things like that. And of course, identifying the words that may serve us better and an audience better to be more mindful of when they're spoken. Like for me, there's ums, like, right, so there's a balancing act between doing those and how much emphasis do we want to put on that. So if we put a lot of emphasis on, okay, those are my challenges, and then we put so much energy into, these are so negative, I should just, why do I do this? And so we build up this energy and this mindset of the things that we have challenges with speech. And then that will seem to come across even more so when we speak, right? And so we can become unconscious of those challenges, but they're still there amplified, right? So sometimes we don't realize that unconsciousness is amplified. So when we go back and listen to how we talk, it seems like if they weren't as amplified, they're not as noticeable. So it's okay if you do a little bit of stuttering, like it, but when it starts to make a big deal out of it, right, that's when it becomes even more noticeable. So it's balancing that with, okay, well, how do we work on that without denying it? And also, not giving it too much energy. Okay, so the Buddha's guidelines for speech, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it helpful? And is it the right time? What is the priority? What is our priority for these 5 things? In general, like if you summed up your speech or our speech in general, which one of these comes to the top of the list of which one I feel confident in succeeding at, and which one needs a little more attention. And then we can also do this in certain situations, because certain situations, some might have more precedence over others. So with the truth one, for me, that's always been, I guess maybe uncommonly, that's been not a thing with me. I would just, other than when other people can detect when they're, just kind of not really respecting truth, and little white lies and, even BSing and stuff like that at a certain point, especially if you can't tell they're doing that. And then there's a fine line there, because we can say things that lack other truths, right? You can say something that's true, but you're deliberately leaving out another part of something truthful that's vital, that would also be kind to the other person, necessary for the other person, helpful, and it would be timely, right? So while it's still accurate in one sense, it's not the full thing. But then you balance that with, okay, well, how long am I going to have to stay here to give the entire truth? Are we going to be like in a court of law where I have to just go through everything? So again, that's where discernment comes in. Some miscellaneous things. There's this acquaintance who just, I guess one of my triggers, he just seems to love the sound of his voice. It's almost like when public speaking, it's just like on a stage and, listen to the golden sound of my voice. It's so amazing. And I have everybody's attention just captivated, listening to me, and it's very important. And of course, I'm being sarcastic to illustrate a point here. But, so why does that trigger me? there's these teachings in spirituality about things being a mirror, right? And kind of the negative part of that, would say, oh, well, that's what you're showing what you need to work on, or that's you being reflected back to you. And well, maybe I'm not going to say it's totally wrong. I like this tweak on it by saying what we notice in others is what we've already addressed in ourselves. So see how there's kind of a slight, more positive, or at least neutral thing, instead of using it as a reward and punishment system, this mere teachings. And, eventually it can get to a point where we can see other people reflecting back our own light. So that's kind of like a higher version of the mere teaching, I would think. For that, you would just be possibly, kind of a self-respect and, wanting honor, confidence, perhaps. Another thing is, it was a time where I would be joining groups and I would be just kind of foisting unrequested wisdom in real life on people and just kind of dominating the group. And it easily caught up to me. And, for whatever reason, some people aren't ready to hear certain things. Some people don't have the tools and a way to manage or address or how to deal with something that would come up, possibly sharing certain things. One of the great things about Insight Timer and the Wisdom app is that it can be, and just online in general, is we can share and not, force it on someone. And if someone's interested, they can come to the platform instead of me going out and just, being like a manic street preacher or something. Yeah, and then also, especially in real life, is not sharing wisdom unless it's specifically requested. And this is a really hard thing for me to come to terms with, because, the masculine just wants to jump in and fix everything, right? Or, okay, I've got all this wisdom. Here's what you need. I still struggle with this. Oh, I can see this. And so another suggestion is you go and you actually practice what you would advise somebody else to do, even more so, before you would advise them. I think it was over Thanksgiving, something came up and I was talking. It's kind of a challenging thing to say. And my dad came in and he said, Josh, you need to think a little bit more before you talk so much. And I said right away, yes, I agree, thank you. It really just kind of cut the tension of what was going on. And then my mom actually said this today, though. She said, and it's maybe a little personal, so I probably, but I'll just say it anyway. She says, why do I need to think before I speak? Why can't I just talk? And I won't say that who that's in reference to or whatever, but, this speaks to righteousness. This is a righteous, sometimes indignation. But it's just kind of me being righteous, just saying that too, right? So it brings to mind, some people have to walk on eggshells to say something. Can there be an ease with saying things, but also, with this freedom of speech we have, it also carries a big responsibility. So I think it's balancing that, because there, like I said earlier, repression versus excessiveness. We can shut down and repress what we want to say, but there's the other end of where just speaking excessively and compulsively too, right? Steve says, I find those transition words so right are not even noticeable unless spoken very often. When a person never uses them, it's even more distracting. That's interesting. Yeah, when a person never uses them, then it's even more distracting. So that's interesting. I have to pay more attention to that when people usually don't do them, and then all of a sudden maybe they'll come in there and throw those in, maybe just to match who they're talking to make them feel more comfortable or something. One of the practices here is reading neutral text with the main intention to hear your voice. So actually the content will be secondary to what's going on in your experience. So if we read a script, then we can focus on other aspects besides the meaning, trying to put together what we're going to say next, thinking about what's been said, all this stuff, what they've said before, what I said in the past, how are they going to perceive this?
on and on and on. So if we read a script, then we can pay more attention to kind of how we're speaking and kind of our own experience of just letting words out. And then we can also read something very charged and contrast it with something read neutrally. There's something called contract revocations, and possibly I'll link those in the show notes if I include this portion in a podcast, which can really get lit up with emotions. So I'll just read. This is a sutta here, and this is actually kind of beautiful. Monks are practitioners. There are these 5 aspects of speech by which others may address you: timely or untimely, true or false, affectionate or harsh, beneficial or unbeneficial, with a mind of goodwill or with inner hate. They may address you with what is true or what is false. They may address you in an affectionate way or a harsh way. They may address you in a beneficial way or an unbeneficial way. They may address you with a mind of goodwill or inner hate. In any event, you should train yourselves. Our minds will be unaffected, and we will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic to that person's welfare with a mind of goodwill and with no inner hate. We will keep pervading him with an awareness imbued with goodwill, and being with him, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing world with an awareness imbued with goodwill, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility, free from ill will. This is how you should train yourselves. Suppose that a man were to come along carrying a hoe and basket, saying, "I will make this great earth be without earth." He would dig here and there, scatter soil here and there, spit here and there, urinate here and there, saying, "Be without earth, be without earth." Now, what do you think? Would he make this great earth be without earth? No, Lord. Why is that? Because this great earth is deep and enormous. It can't easily be made to be without earth. The man would reap only a share of weariness and disappointment. In the same way, monks or practitioners, there are these 5 aspects of speech by which others may address you: timely or untimely, true or false, affectionate or harsh, beneficial or unbeneficial, with a mind of goodwill or with inner hate. Others may address you in a timely way or in an untimely way. They may address you with what is true, what is false. They may address you in an affectionate way or a harsh way. They may address you in a beneficial way or an unbeneficial way. They may address you with a mind of goodwill or with inner hate. In any event, you should train yourselves. Our mind will be unaffected, and when we say no evil words, we will remain sympathetic to that person's welfare with a mind of goodwill and with no inner hate. We will keep pervading him with an awareness imbued with goodwill, and beginning with him, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing world with an awareness imbued with goodwill, equal to the great earth, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility, free from ill will. This is how you train yourself. Speaking, the inverse of that is, well, what are we listening to? What are we taking in? Are we listening to really crappy programming on television or media, right? A lot of times we wouldn't listen to something. It's flipping that and saying, well, do we want to be putting out something that isn't beneficial, that isn't helpful, that isn't timely, that isn't true, that isn't kind? The timely thing is interesting. I don't think that gets mentioned enough. It's just like you wouldn't really kind of badmouth somebody at a funeral, right? Or gossip about them and say how all the bad things they did, right next to their immediate family at their funeral. It just doesn't seem timely, I guess. Well, it's also unkind. And even this talk, it's maybe there might have been a more beneficial talk closer to Christmas time with speaking, when people aren't really focused as much on speaking, I would think, as all the other stuff going on. Maybe caroling or something, but so this is more experimental for a practice. So can we identify our challenges with being down on ourselves and then just start talking, focusing mainly on them? So we identify where we think we have challenges, where we feel we have challenges in our speech, make it an intent, maybe in regular conversation, instead of focusing so much on how we usually go about our speech. In the background, now this is challenging, you might have to do this with a friend. Focus on those challenges. See when they start to come up, what our response is to them. And so we can put more maybe emotional energy, mental energy into those challenges, just kind of like a laboratory to study them through our speech. I know it's kind of challenging. So for me, it would be like just talking and now just focusing on whether I'm going to say, like, right, and other stutterings. However, I won't waste your time by just getting ready to say, right. There, said right again. So probably need to practice my own suggestions before I ask others to do the same. So it's an idea. Perhaps I'll practice that and share it at some other point in time. And then again, reiterating this point of how much do we want to amplify this unskillfulness and these perceived challenges? And then how much are we going to balance that with not being in denial about them, being conscious about them too. So, and Maria says, this talk is very timely, especially right before the holidays where I can practice being more skillful with kinds. Of course, yeah, I stand corrected because, of course, we're all going to be socializing around the holidays. Maybe some people are already there and have got all their preparations made. Of course, that's a no-brainer, right? Way under my radar. Thank you. San, I found it effective to work on my throat chakra, an area I'd recommend others looking to. Yeah, and that's another thing. There's like generational trauma in my family around the throat and neck, like broken necks, or well, a broken neck, not from me, but thyroid conditions, spots on the thyroid, throat cancer was one. So yeah, plenty of that stuff. Not to mention just harshness and the connection between the head and the heart, right? That's the bridge. Some people not expressing enough, some people expressing very unskillfully, unwise. And communication, right? Yeah, I mean, even if it's nonverbal communication, that's how we're in relationship in the world, not just to others, but to all kinds of things, especially with ourselves.
A brief addendum here on the omitted decisive speech and slander balanced with harmonious, unifying speech. Or maybe not balanced so much as abandoning one for the other. And how relevant is it to completely forget about unifying speech in the United States, the United States, not the divided states. However, it seems almost more accurate these days to be a divided states, divided amongst ourselves, divided within ourselves in this country. How many times do we, or at least I know I do, prioritize certain views, opinions, agendas, preferences, in doing so in a righteous or entitled way, or maybe even just out of pain, lashing out, maybe doing what's been done to us, maybe doing what's been done to me before. And so we lose sight of concord, unification, togetherness, maybe some call it oneness. More accurately, I find interconnectivity, interconnectedness, interrelated, unable to exist in a vacuum, for long anyway. And so what can we do to bring more concord to speech? How can we unite instead of divide? How can these choices be made? And how can we choose the opposite? How can we choose not to cause polarization, division, separation, alienation, conflict, pushing people away and apart, elevating some over another, compartmentalizing this and that as it's desired or needed or fitted to how we feel things ought to be or our preferences? And how do we not get down on ourselves and beat ourselves up when we fall short while resolving, intending concord, unification, and also noticing what effects unifying speech has on ourselves and others, and noticing the opposite, where we can see and know in this life we have now. And that's week 3 for December 2021 of the Pāramitā Challenge. Month 4 of the Pāramitā Challenge, December 2021. This is from the 10 Abodes, stages 4 through 7. I'll read these, and the brief description or explanation, and then we'll come back to them individually. Number 4, the abode of producing virtues. We abide peacefully in the principle of quote-unquote no self, where the seed natures are purified. 5, the abode of being endowed with skillful means. We abide in innumerable good roots and use expedient means to aid in the view of emptiness. Number 6, the abode of correct mind. We abide in the completion of the wisdom of emptiness as found in the Pāramitā suttas. 7, the abode of no backsliding. We abide wherein one does not retrogress from the experience of the 3 gates of liberation: wishlessness, signlessness, and emptiness. Within all 4 of these, the common theme is emptiness. And I've likely mentioned this before. Some of the things I'm ready to talk about, maybe some new things as well. So in Pali, it's sunyata. Sanskrit, shunyata, if I'm pronouncing this right. They're often translated, like I said, as emptiness, stillness, even heard maybe light of presence. And I offer this up maybe in addition to those, or maybe this would be more accurate for some similar notions of sunyata, I don't know. But how about this? Impending immediacy. So I'll just leave it at that without really going into explanation now. Maybe if that deserves unpacking later, that will happen then. So I always wonder, empty of what? Empty, if there's emptiness, that means there's been some emptying done, right? But what's been emptied out? And what remains? I've heard some of the teachings on emptiness are really only encouraged to practice, study, and contemplate this concept, maybe this truth, this notion of emptiness, only when we're in a very stable, gathered, and collected, in a unified state of being and state of mind. Because it has the possibility to destabilize, to scatter, to fragment, and to divide the mind in being, potentially. However, with my understanding, if there's some stability to be able to look at this, then a deeper truth about reality can be seen in this notion of emptiness. So one way we can investigate this is by investigating phenomena. And whatever phenomena is experienced, we can keep going behind. And so something is presented, and then, well, what's behind that? Through investigation, maybe get an answer, and well, then what's behind that? And behind that, and behind that, underneath that. And I'll just leave that there without coming up with any conclusions for you to try for yourself. And also beyond. Some more, instead of the more deconstructive taking away method, the going beyond. So what lies beyond? And this ties right into the 3rd one, or the 6th one here, abiding in the contemplation of the wisdom of the emptiness found in the Pāramitā suttas. So there's culminates in the line, gate, paragate, bodhiswaha, and have a couple translations here, but I'm not really fond of either one. Gone, everyone gone to the other shore, awakening, svaha. Or gone beyond, gone utterly beyond, enlightenment, hail. I don't know about this word, hail. It's just kind of an awkward, unused phrase in current English, especially at the end of a sentence. But anyway, you kind of get the idea. So mentioning previously this emptying version, I recently heard, I believe it was Gil Fronsdal, when speaking on the shorter discourse on emptiness, this sutta, he looked at emptiness as a verb of emptying. So this process or act of emptying, instead of looking at it like a thing, another thing, objectifying emptiness, which is kind of contradictory, maybe a misnomer. So this process of, well, what's extra, what's not needed, and what is the relationship like for emptying? Do we take it as grief and loss, lack, Or is it a clearing, a releasing, a freeing, an unbinding, a shedding off of that which no longer serves us nor those we love, especially in the long term? Perhaps another concept to explore with emptiness is essence. So can we really tune into an unchanging, static essence of anything that can be captured and reproduced just the way we like it for as long as we like it? And I would say probably not in the long run that I know of. But how much do we try to do something like this, to really pin something down and say, that's the way it is, or I know this, I'm going to get exactly what I want from this and act on the way that I want, and this is going to have the certain outcome that I desire. And then, well, we might be able to do that for a while, but is that a long-term solution for happiness? I don't know. I invite you to investigate that for yourself. A little vague, and it would help to illustrate this with specific examples, but maybe you can use our imagination here, or memory, our theory on real-life examples of that. Well, one way is expectations, right? If, let's say, your expectations are met, is that going to really provide ultimate lasting happiness, or is it just going to be on to the next expectation under the guise of, oh, that might do it for me really, or maybe if I can just get enough expectations met in a certain amount of time, then that'll do it, and I can just keep that up. And so that turns kind of into micromanaging with a lot of energy. And of course, not all of our expectations are always met. And then when we're not aware of that truth, then there can be disappointment, let down, this kind of deluded thought that it should have went one way, but it didn't go that way. And so we don't realize that that's not a lasting long-term strategy for satisfactoriness. And just think for a moment, if you would get your way all the time, then how boring would that be? Where would there low growth and learning be in that? Okay, so another notion of emptiness is unbalance that can come with this misunderstanding notion of having carte blanche, because nothing is really real and substantive. So what does it matter what happens, or anything I do or anything happens? It's all empty. There's nothing to it. So what does anything matter? Just kind of this nihilistic misunderstanding. And, maybe that is on an ultimate level, but until I get there, we get there, that kind of line of thought doesn't really apply. You go, you get pulled over by authority, or you come in with authority and you start saying something like that. See how that's gonna, how that's gonna help you out. Probably not too much, or anybody else around you. And then there's also this unbalance of the inferior ego because of this notion of, oh, I'm insignificant, I'm less than, everything's futile, nothing I do matters, nothing matters. This kind of small me, which is actually still an ego. And this is not a helpful, wise, or skillful view of life and reality in the world, and of this notion of self we have. But sometimes it doesn't help either to just condemn somebody for having this view either, right? So how do we convey that and resolve that and turn towards a more helpful view? So there's this lovely quote by Nisargadatta Maharaj, something like, "Wisdom tells me I'm nothing, love tells me I'm everything. Between these two, my life flows." I just love the truth of that. So another notion of emptiness is like this womb-like nature, a womb where something is born from, where sometimes it can be empty of life, and sometimes it can be incubating, growing, preparing for life to launch into this world, right? Not like a .com so much, but we all understand this, right? To some degree anyway. And then
when investigating emptiness, consider pairing it with non-emptiness, because without the way existence is now, how it is now, how would we know one without the other? How would we know emptiness without non-emptiness? And then what kind of reference points do we have for emptiness? I think the classic example I can think of is a cup being filled and full, and then it being turned and emptied out. So once it held water or liquid of some sort. Now, after it's been emptied, it becomes emptied. It becomes empty. So now going back to each individual one. Number 4, the abode of producing virtues. We abide peacefully in the principle of no self, where the seed natures are purified. The abode of producing virtues. We pretty much know what an abode is. It's a kind of a living place, a dwelling place, a location where one abides, and producing virtues. So virtues, we just kind of maybe sub out goodness that can be put into action, kind of like a value or an ethic that can be played out in real life and also as an ideology. But I guess the question is, can these be produced? Don't they inherently exist? Aren't they there? So do they really need producing, or perhaps they need kind of more realizing, knowing, and then implementing? But I guess it could be said that, okay, if they're not there, then they need to be brought into being, and that could be a production of sorts. This word of production, it has these kind of like mechanistic, capitalistic, maybe, the bad parts of capitalism anyway, or the unhelpful parts of capitalism. It's machine-like nature of production. So I don't know if maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I like exemplifying virtues or realizing virtues would be a preference. And then we abide peacefully in the principle of no self, where the seed natures are purified. So we abide peacefully. That's pretty straightforward. In principles, so in the principle of no self. So this might have been also said before, but if something is true, does it need to be a principle, or what are principles? And then, of course, I prefer not self to no self, because not everybody can immediately see a no self, right? Tell people, who are you? Oh, there's no self. Okay, what are you talking about? But not self is more of like a strategy. Can we really pin down a self? This has been gone over before. So if you investigate what we normally take for self as the five aggregates of body, feeling, or hedonic tone, perceptions, sankhara, perhaps fabrications or formations, volitional formations, mental formations, and then the last one is consciousness. And then further look into those by each one saying, well, am I the body? Do I own the body? Is the body in me? Am I in the body? So after investigating all those and coming to the knowledge you have of those now, what exactly is a self? Of course, we have some kind of notion. That's how we navigate the world. So in one respect, there's a self. This I call it Josh, that's what, I go through the world, and that's, people call me Josh, I'm Josh. And, in one respect, that's that. But if you go deep, deep, deep into it, none of those things, they're not self. So in the respect that they're always the same, and that we have control over all those different aspects of it. Okay, so spiraling back around to the rest of this, we abide peacefully in the principle of no self, where the seed natures are purified. So again, I think the seed natures are a Mahayana term about alaya consciousness, and I'm still very unclear. Of course, a seed contains within it all the, instructions or information to grow the full plant within that, given the right causes and conditions. But, where are these? How do we pin them down? How can we investigate these, especially with the current state of consciousness and conditions for investigating something like this? Why is this concept so important, especially that it's its own delineation of consciousness. And then this notion of purity. So obviously we can see certain things on a relative level that are cleaner than other things, that have more purity levels than contamination levels. But how are seed natures purified? If something's truly natural in its natural state, what needs to be purified and what doesn't? And who's to say or what's to say what does or doesn't? And how does this notion of no self, self and no self, not self, come into seed natures and purification? We abide peacefully in the principle of no self, where the seed natures are purified. So if I had to guess what this means is, if we don't have this entrenched story, notion, and solidification of a I am, this me, this is who I am, this is the way it is, and that's just how it is, without, questioning or being open to looking deeper, then that can potentially cause problems. And so maybe the longer we keep that notion and keep reinforcing that notion and disseminating that notion like a seed, then we plant those seeds, and then they have the potential to either bear bad fruit or not sprout at all and not be helpful. So maybe that's what is meant by seed natures. And then, so if we give that up, those entrenched stories and notions, then perhaps that's how they're purified, by not clinging to a fixed notion of self. This is who I am. This is how it is. This is mine. I'm made of this. So when we can lessen those bonds, then there's a type of purification that takes place. Okay, number 5, the abode of being endowed with skillful means. We abide in the innumerable good roots and use expedient means to aid in the view of emptiness. The abode of being endowed with skillful means. So endowment means, right, you're given something, something is bestowed upon you, if I'm getting that right. Skillful means, it's pretty straightforward, like there's certain ways a goldsmith would operate that will produce a beautiful finished piece of gold in whatever is being done, like a piece of jewelry or an adornment on some other object. And there's ways that could happen where that wouldn't be the outcome or the case at the end. So are we actually endowed with these skillful means? Well, some people would say, yes, there's a certain degree that you're born with certain talents and proclivities and predisposition towards certain things, perhaps because of genetics. Maybe if you're into previous lives, and maybe you've already had tons and tons of practice and training for that. But that gets into, well, is it really endowed, or is it come by association, by associating with people who will support and nurture and foster those things? And or has there been a lot of effort and desire to develop skills? So that's the question I have with the being endowed with skillful. And then we abide in innumerable good roots and use expedient means to aid in the view of emptiness. This whole notion of abiding in roots, that's really interesting, right? So I love this notion of roots, how it's kind of underground and dark, yet it's a huge support, a necessary part for the rest of the plant. This spreading out, this absorption, being able to take in nutrients, goodness, while still completely in the dark. So what would a bad root be? Well, there's the poison roots, which I think is more accurate than bad roots, of greed, ill will, and ignorance or delusion. And the good roots are the opposites of those. So generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. So innumerable good roots. I love that. It kind of expands on those. So I guess it's just variations of those. There's all kinds of other good qualities too, I would suppose. And use expedient means to aid in the view of emptiness. This notion of expedient means kind of comes back to this impending immediacy. But there's also expedient means there's also this notion of spiritual urgency. So yes, we can
use quickness and speed without being in a hurry. That's possible. I would like to know what these expedient means might be, and if there's also an upside to having slower means, or if both can be possible. And the view of emptiness, it's interesting how it's mentioned as a view here. So when would be skillful to use a view of emptiness, and when would it be skillful not to have a view of emptiness? Or once it's fully realized, how would that affect things? Okay, number 6, the abode of correct mind. We abide in the completion of the wisdom of emptiness is found in the Pāramitā sutras. So I haven't read all these. I've just pretty much heard the Heart Sutra, which includes what I've gone over before here, the Gate, Paragate, Bodhisattva, gone beyond, gone utterly beyond, enlightenment hail. So it's hard for me to comment on the completion of the wisdom of emptiness found in those sutras, because that would take a lot of study and commentary to go over. Just trying to verbalize penetration and knowledge and realization of the wisdom contained there. And so, how do you really talk about abiding in the completion of that? I guess you can point at it, but more than likely it would be an exemplification and state of being, how we conduct ourselves in life that would show an abiding in that wisdom, and also in actions and speech and thought of those. So that is the abode of correct mind, right? Right view, right intention. What am I missing here? Basically, the wisdom part. Okay, number 7. Well, before that, correct mind. So what would be an uncorrect mind, right? Or non-correct mind? And of course, I don't know if anybody really can just give a definition of mind that's just immediately apparent and realizable to everybody everywhere. It's a kind of a complex thing, to say the least. But I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just kind of out of the scope of this podcast to define correct mind and expound on the wisdom of emptiness in the Pāramitā. Anyway, 7, the abode of no backsliding. We abide wherein one does not retrogress from the experience of the 3 gates of liberation: wishlessness, signlessness, and emptiness. So we've gone over the emptiness quite a bit, so we'll just set that aside for now. And I've kind of mentioned the wishlessness and signlessness before, about this notion of self, no self, not self, and how having views of the solid self and having things remain the way we want them in the long term is a setup for disappointment, or at best just keeps self-perpetuating. So that's what leads to dukkha, and dukkha as stress or unsatisfactoriness. And so when we see that nothing really can provide lasting satisfaction in the long run, at least in this world, the worldly realm, then we don't get so attached to our wishes. And so it's okay if things come. It's also okay if things don't come. So this wishlessness, this non-devastation for not having our preferences met, what we really want, not getting what we want, getting what we don't want. The emotional charge tends to leak out of that. And where we really yearned and wanted something so bad before lessens, and where a wish can become less of a wish and not as big as a deal. It doesn't mean we still can't have choices and preferences and, make goals, achieve things, but we're not clinging to that or what happens or doesn't happen. So it's the wishlessness, signlessness. This one I have more challenges of understanding this term, but it goes to anicca, this notion that inconstancy. So maybe a sign. So we see a sign and it's not exactly what it is. It represents something else, right? So one thing stands for another. One thing will inform us, or we think it will inform us of what we need to do or don't need to do. So what happens when signs lessen and we come into seeing more of things the way they are instead of
or representation or ideas of one thing. Again, the story of living in story instead of reality, living in an interpretation of reality instead of direct reality. So maybe this is a bad example. Take a road sign. So it will give directions to turn right. But if you actually go up to that sign, maybe it's made out of metal and you can hit it with the hand and it'll make it a loud sound. It has, paint and maybe an arrow on it, maybe some letters in a language. And it's a certain shape and it's on a certain signpost. And maybe it's attached to another post or the ground. And so that would be kind of more of the reality of that sign, even though it may contain some kind of information and then prompting for a choice or an order to follow or a recommendation to follow. But the actuality of that sign is one way, is the physical description I gave. So that would be maybe one notion of what is the actual reality of that sign and what is our story about that sign, or what are we taking that sign to mean or be, and what aren't we taking that sign to mean or be, and how helpful is this or not, or what's beyond and behind these things, and how relevant is that or could that be? So yes, we take the practicality of the information, and then in times of reflection, we can realize there's so much more to existence and reality than a lot of times we've been taught or led to believe, or the current capacity that we have. And instead of this being another thing to fall short of, turn into a project, strive or fail at, it can be a, wow, that's amazing. How amazing. So that's week 4 of the Pāramitā Challenge, December 2021.